From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
اليوم لا فرق بين مدينة ومدينة. اليوم لا فرق بين ليبي وليبي.
Today, there is no difference between cities. Today, there is no difference between Libyans. We will create history altogether, as we were all equal in suffering from a dictatorship for 42 years. We need to be equal now in democracy.
Rebels take most of Libya's capital of Tripoli. 3 of Moammar Gadhafi's sons are in custody. The whereabouts of the Libyan leader remain unknown. We'll go to Tripoli for an update and speak with Libyan poet Khaled Matawa, as well as Juan Cole. Then the West Memphis 3 are free, one of them from death row after more than 18 years behind bars.
Basically, when we went to trial the first time, they came in with ghost stories, rumors, innuendo, things that really had nothing to do with the case whatsoever. And they knew now the whole world was watching them. They wouldn't be able to do the same thing.
We'll speak with the filmmaker who documented the West Memphis 3 story. They were convicted in the slayings of 3 8-year-old boys in 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Heavy fighting and gun battles have broken out in parts of Tripoli after NATO-backed rebels marched into the Libyan capital overnight. Some reports indicate forces loyal to Moammar Gadhafi's now control just 10 or 15% of the city. 3 of Gadhafi's sons have been seized. Moammar Gadhafi's whereabouts have been unknown for days. Gadhafi's presidential guard reportedly surrendered Sunday. Celebrations have been held across Libya over the possible end of Gadhafi's 42 years in power. Hours before the rebels entered Tripoli, a former deputy to Moammar Gadhafi appeared on Al Jazeera Saturday to voice his support to Libya's rebel movement trying to overthrow Gadhafi.
The people of Tripoli, who account for more than a quarter of Libya's population, rise up as one man, woman, children, and the elderly. Enough. 0 hour is here. Enough. The areas which have not yet stamped the fear with their feet should defeat that fear tonight and unite, as your enemy is fear.
Meanwhile, Musa Ibrahim, Libya's information minister, lashed out at NATO for backing the rebellion.
Every blood, every drop of Libyan blood shed by these rebels is the responsibility of the Western world, and especially NATO's countries. So we hold Mr. Obama, Mr. Cameron, and Mr. Sarkozy morally responsible for every single unnecessary death that takes place in this country.
We'll have more on Libya after headlines. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad warned on Sunday any military action against his country would backfire on those who carried it out. Assad's message came just days after President Obama and the European Union called for him to step down. Meanwhile, the UN Human Rights Council is set to hold a special session today to examine the Syrian government's violent crackdown on protesters during the 5-month-old uprising. A pair of Americans who have been held in Iran for 2 years have been given 8-year jail sentences. Shane Bauer and Josh Fatal were arrested in 2009 along with their friend Sarah Shourd after they mistakenly crossed from northern Iraq into Iran while on a hike. Shourd was released in September. Iran's chief prosecutor said the men were found guilty of illegal entry and espionage. Their trial took place behind closed doors, and the evidence against them has not been made public. The men have adamantly denied the spy charges. Bauer is a freelance journalist who's contributed to Democracy Now! And other news outlets. A lawyer for the men said he would appeal the sentence, which shocked their families and friends. A Japanese newspaper is reporting residents of some towns closest to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant may be barred from returning home for several decades. Radiation in the towns is as much as 25 times the level considered safe by the Japanese government. Workers at Verizon have ended their 15-day strike and are set to return to work tonight, even though they have not agreed to a new contract. Union leaders say the decision by the 45,000 workers to end the strike was made after they reached an agreement with Verizon on how bargaining will proceed. Larry Cohen, president of the Communication Workers of America, said, quote, "We don't consider this a victory in any way. We consider it progress toward a good process at Verizon," he said. The strike was the largest in the United States in several years. In other labor news, the faculty at Central Michigan University has announced plans to go on strike today on the first day of classes. More than 110 people have been arrested since Saturday for taking part in sit-ins outside the White House, calling on the Obama administration to reject the Keystone XL pipeline, a proposed 1,500-mile pipeline to take tar sands oil from Canada to refineries in Texas. Organizer Bill McKibben and over 70 others were arrested Saturday on the first day of a 2-week series of actions. McKibben and dozens of others remain in jail. Dr. Sidney Parker of Maryland was arrested during Sunday's action.
We are here because this is not just an environmental issue, it's also a very big health issue, and that's why we've come out today, and that's why we're so committed. So personally, I have never been arrested before. I'm not, I don't do this for fun. I'm here because I think it is such an important issue that it really demands this kind of action, and it demands that level of commitment from myself.
Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said Friday that Iraq has agreed to negotiate an extension of U.S. forces there beyond the scheduled withdrawal date at the end of the year. Roughly 46,000 U.S. troops remain in Iraq, along with more than 64,000 private contractors. Last week, Iraq suffered its bloodiest day of the year, with over a dozen coordinated attacks, leaving 89 people dead and more than 300 injured. Israel and Hamas have reportedly agreed to a ceasefire after 5 days of cross-border violence. The violence erupted Thursday when militants crossed into southern Israel and carried out a series of deadly attacks near the Egyptian border. Since then, Israel's launched a series of airstrikes against Gaza. On Sunday, at least 9 Palestinians, including a 13-year-old boy, were wounded from Israeli drones and F-16 fighter jet attacks. In presidential campaign news, former Utah Governor John Huntsman accused some of his Republican rivals of being too extreme. Huntsman criticized Texas Governor Rick Perry's skepticism about global warming and evolution.
The Republican Party becomes the party, the anti-science party, we have a huge problem. We lose a whole lot of people who would otherwise allow us to win the election in 2012. When we take a position that isn't willing to embrace evolution, when we take a position that basically runs counter to what 98 of 100 climate scientists have said, what the National Academy of Sciences has said about what is causing climate change and man's contribution to it, I think we find ourselves on the wrong side of science and therefore in a losing position.
New reports have surfaced that a staffer responsible for presidential hopeful Michelle Bachmann's faith-based organizing was once charged with terrorism in Uganda. According to The Atlantic magazine, Peter Waldron was arrested in Africa in February of 2006 for allegedly possessing a number of assault rifles and ammunition just days before Uganda's first multi-party elections in 20 years. Waldron spent 37 days in a prison outside Kampala before his charges were dropped. A Ugandan newspaper accused Waldron of collaborating with Congolese rebels to capture the leader of a Ugandan guerrilla group. According to the paper, the International Criminal Court placed a $1.7 million bounty on his head. In other campaign news, the San Diego Union Tribune's reporting presidential candidate Mitt Romney has applied for a permit to bulldoze his 3,000-square-foot, $12 million beachfront vacation home in La Jolla, California, and replace it with one nearly 4 times its size. A campaign official said the existing $12 million home is, quote, inadequate for their needs. Romney lives in Massachusetts, but also has vacation homes in New Hampshire and Utah. A trio of men convicted of brutally murdering 3 young boys in Arkansas in 1993 were released from prison Friday. Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, Jr., otherwise known as the West Memphis Three, entered a rare plea deal in which they maintained their innocence but pled guilty to murder, with the state of Arkansas recognizing them as child killers safe enough to be set free. The men were convicted of the killings after an investigation largely fueled by unsubstantiated rumors of a satanic ritual. Baldwin and Miss Kelly were sentenced to life. Eccles was placed on death row. The case has become a cause célèbre over the years, with critics arguing the men were targeted because they were outsiders in the community. In 2007, new forensic tests of evidence at the crime scene turned up no genetic material belonging to any of the three men. Damien Eccles spoke to reporters after being released from death row.
They knew they wouldn't be able to get away with a lot of stuff that they got away with the first time. They knew there would be more people watching this, more attention on this case, so they wouldn't be able to pull the same tricks. You know, basically when we went to trial the first time, they came in with ghost stories, rumors, innuendo, things that really had nothing to do with the case whatsoever. And they knew now the whole world was watching them. They wouldn't be able to do the same thing. They would have to come with some sort of concrete physical evidence, and they didn't have any, and they knew that.
We'll have more on the West Memphis 3 later in the broadcast. In news from India, tens of thousands of people marched in New Delhi Sunday to show support for the anti-corruption activist Anna Hazare, who's been on hunger strike for the past week. He's vowed not to end his fast until the Indian government creates a new national anti-corruption agency. On Saturday, Anna Hazare spoke to supporters.
The second war for India's independence has begun. This is the beginning of a new revolution. Now the flame of hope that has been lit by all the brothers and sisters, students and youth of this nation must not get extinguished. The fire should not go away.
While Hazare's campaign has brought tens of thousands to the streets, he has vocal critics within the government and among some Indian activists. Writing in the Hindu newspaper, the Indian author Arundhati Roy writes, quote, "While his means may be Gandhian, Anna Hazare's demands are certainly not." Roy writes Gandhi would have been dismayed by Hazare's vision of an all-powerful centralized ombudsman. Here in New York City, an 82-year-old resident of Brooklyn facing foreclosure was allowed to stay in her house Friday after over 200 people gathered in front of her home to block the eviction. Mary Lee Ward has lived in her home for 44 years. Her supporters say she's facing foreclosure because she was a victim of deceptive and predatory lending practices. She spoke from her front stoop after learning the eviction was put off for now.
We're not slaves anymore. My grandfather was a slave, but I'm not, and they're not going to force me to do anything against my will. You got to put up a hard fight for the faith, and that means the fact that you have to stick with it when you know that you're right. You know you have the evidence. You know you have the facts. Don't let nobody walk over you. Don't let nobody make you a slave.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.